Just get us up to speed on what the administration is saying about the quality of the status of those negotiations and what we can expect here as we begin the new week.
Yeah, I mean, I would first point out that the night before aboard Air Force One, the president is the one who told us he would be talking about Iran in the Oval Office Saturday morning. So you did see a bunch of us race to the White House Saturday morning, hoping that we would get an update on the status of talks. But the president didn't take a single question, as you said. He mentioned very briefly at the top that there were very good conversations ongoing. He said that they tried to get a little cute. And they tried to close up the strait as they have done for years. As you guys know, the strait was open before the U.S. and Israeli military campaign on Iran. We didn't hear or see the president for the rest of the day. He spent the remainder of the day at his golf club. We do know that Steve Witkoff, his golf clubs were spotted. So we do believe the president met with Steve Witkoff at his Virginia golf club.
The bag was sighted.
We now know what the actual Witkoff clubs look like. That's how we're doing this?
We do, yes. That's where we're at.
That's incredible.
But he continues to strike an optimistic tone about the status of these talks, even as both sides, as you know, remain extremely far apart on some really core issues.
Philip, I want to go to you because we're seeing some unverified reports this morning coming through Al Jazeera that the talks are now pushed and they're saying likely sometime next week, and that's citing two unnamed Pakistani officials. Considering we still have no official details, I'm assuming this isn't happening tomorrow. Are you just in Islamabad in perpetuity now? Do you have any idea when these talks may or may not be happening?
Look, I'm here to tell you that I cannot confirm that there will be another round of talks here in Islamabad next week. But what I can tell you is that the preparations for potential talks are definitely now underway here in the Pakistani capital. You can see behind me, this is the biggest tourist attraction here in Islamabad. This is Faisal Mosque. It is still open, but the main access road to it, that is now closed. That is why you can probably not hear the sounds of motorbikes and cars and all the people we've seen over the last few days wandering toward and back and forth from Faisal Mosque. They are not here today. It is just one of many signs we are seeing here on this Saturday morning here in Islamabad that preparations are underway. The two main hotels that had been taken over by the respective delegations last weekend, they have now been taken over by the Pakistani government, meaning any guests have been told to leave. That is a very clear indication right there, and there is footage right now that is circulating all around Pakistan of U.S. military planes landing at a military base just on the outskirts of Islamabad. All of that indicates that preparations are underway. That doesn't mean that I can confirm to you that these takes will be happening, but the rumors all throughout last week were that there was going to be a second round of negotiations, despite the fact that, especially over the last 24 or 48 hours, the rhetoric has again become more aggressive between Iran and the United States, despite the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is pretty much entirely blocked right now. That does not mean that on the diplomatic front, these two sides can't be putting together the building blocks to actually see each other again in person here in Islamabad at some point next week. The date, I cannot give you right now.
Colonel Sanders, let me turn to you. And so absent comment from the president, kind of official word from the White House or from Iranian counterparts, we're looking at the latest media reporting. And there was a big piece in the Wall Street Journal that broke yesterday. And the journal's reporting that the U.S. military is preparing in the coming days to board Iran-linked oil tankers and seize commercial ships in international waters. The journal citing U.S. officials saying they're going to be expanding their naval crackdown beyond the Middle East. What does this say to you? It does seem here, as we've watched this back and forth about the strait, whether it's open or not, that the continued presence of this U.S. blockade is really perhaps the biggest sticking point here for the Iranians and for this ceasefire generally.
Absolutely. I think it's the United States counterpoint to what Iran is doing to kind of hold the straits hostage as they did over the weekend. I wasn't surprised to see that there was additional attack in the strait, specifically when they were shooting at some of the tankers, just because they want to be able to add whatever leverage they possibly can. The naval blockade from the U.S. side, I think, is specifically there. Obviously, it's worked in terms of turning some of the tankers around. The use of the Marine Expeditionary Units being there, the 11th and the 13th Marine Expeditionary expeditionary units are trained in this, boarding and interdiction teams known as VBSS. I think it's one of the areas where both sides are showing, hey, look, we still have this capacity. But if you recall in the Iran-Israel conflict for the 12-day war, they continue to shoot at each other right up until the point of the agreement, and even shot at each other a couple times even afterwards. So I still think that this is mostly posturing more than anything.
Philip, I want to go back to you because I want to dig into a little bit about how much we think these sides are still talking. Axios today is reporting that the Pakistani army chief, who has been kind of instrumental in facilitating this, held mediation talks by the U.S., between the U.S. and Iran. He was in Tehran last week, and they're also reporting that there was at least one phone call between the U.S., Iran, with possibly Pakistan mediating. Do you have any information on how those efforts are going, or what communication has been happening even between the parties? As you see, it seems like they are gearing up for something there, even if we're not sure what or when.
Yeah, and certainly Pakistan, as the mediator and as the only mediator in this war right now, is confident that its efforts are working out. That's why you're seeing these preparations for a potential another round of talks here in Islamabad. And you're right to mention Asim Munir. He is the head of the armed forces. He is called by Donald Trump his favorite field marshal. He is crucial in this. He spent three days in Tehran meeting everybody on the Iranian side who is of import, who is part of this negotiating team. He met the parliament speaker. He also met the foreign minister. Those are precisely the leaders of the Iranian delegation. Now, what does a mediator do? Well, essentially passes messages back and forth. He took an American message with him to Tehran, and presumably he got one from Tehran as well to hand over to Washington. Now, I can't confirm whether there has been any direct contact between the United States and Iran during this time, during these last few days. In theory, at least, the only contact that there has been face-to-face here in Islamabad last weekend during that first round of talks. But you certainly can't deny that there's the possibility that there might be some direct contact. For now, the mediator is the one passing messages back and forth and making sure that there is some kind of common ground between the two sides. And certainly from what we're hearing here in Islamabad, the Pakistani negotiators, or mediators in this case, are pretty confident that despite, again, the rhetoric and despite all the posturing, that these are two sides that are actually getting closer.
Courtney, the president has made threats against Iran and walked the timetable back a handful of times now. And you mentioned that the president took questions on Air Force One over the weekend. On Friday, he fielded questions from reporters. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about the status of that ceasefire.
If you don't have a deal by Wednesday when the ceasefire ends, will you extend the ceasefire or will you start attacks again?
Maybe I won't extend it. Okay. But the blockade is going to remain. But maybe I won't extend it. So you have a blockade, and unfortunately we'll have to start dropping bombs again.
We have to start dropping bombs again, the president saying in those comments. So, Courtney, I'd love some insight, if you have it, into how the president is thinking about the extension of this ceasefire, this pause in attacks on Iran. Again, it's coming, at the end of that is coming up very shortly here, and he has been ambiguous about his willingness to extend that.
Well, that's Donald Trump's style, right? He likes to keep everyone guessing. He likes to keep everyone on edge. But I would note that we've been here several times throughout this war where the U.S. seemingly ramps up pressure just before a deadline, and then both sides pull back and extend a pause in fighting. And I think that is really the core objective here, is to just extend the pause in fighting. And one thing I'll note is the Wall Street Journal report that you referred to about the U.S. that the U.S. would begin boarding Iranian-linked ships. I asked White House officials about this yesterday, and they pointed to the Joint Chief of Staff's Chairman Dan Kane's comments at the Pentagon briefing last week, in which he had mentioned that this was going to be an option that they would pursue if things didn't progress. So I do think that there is just a bit of a pressure campaign here to really send a message to Iran that they need to come to the table and start to agree on some of these points of contention so that they can move forward for a lasting peace agreement.
Colonel Sanders, I know David asked you about that report, and I want to follow up as well. I'm wondering logistically at what point even the massive resources the U.S. has sent to the region start to get strained. If you are trying to enforce a blockade, hunt down and board these ships and examine them for, sanctions violations in other areas, other arenas. And then you're looking at the prospect of this ceasefire not holding, so potentially resuming a bombing campaign or whatever else the president wants to do. At some point, is he limited by the capacity of the U.S. military, or does that capacity expand depending on what the commander-in-chief wants it to do?
Yeah, I would say so. The capacity is strained, but it is something that can be transferable if you think about different theaters of operation. So it ends up being a decision calculus that the president has to look at and say, am I willing to take risk in other theaters like the Pacific in order to continue to bring capability over? Military Sea Lift Command has been strained in terms of creating pretty much a conveyor belt, if you will, of resources, fuel, logistics, and food, everything else that's going across. That part has played a huge part in terms of being able to prepare for the blockade. But as you mentioned, even during the ceasefire, that has still continued to be pushed, even though other areas may have stepped down, right, from aircraft overflights and number of munitions that have been spent are less. It still doesn't mean that ecosystem is strained. And so at this point in time, a lot of the operational planning, I believe, is tied into this, is saying, if this were to continue into another bombing campaign, would I be able to lift and shift fires from and resources from a different theater of operation in order to support this one?
Phil Crowther, let me go back to you and to this initial announcement that we got from the Iranian foreign minister that the Strait was open with maybe some small conditions here. What do we know about the impact that's had in Iran? I know there's been some pushback against the foreign minister by some more hardline members of that regime. What do we know about the way that that's played there and to the degree to which that represents broader government thinking about how this conflict should proceed?
Yeah, it certainly does appear that some of the statements that we have been hearing coming out of Iran have been made for either public consumption in Iran or indeed for consumption by the leadership there, by the conservative leadership of Iran. This is not a country that is necessarily entirely singing from the same hymn sheet. There are those who want to be very, very strict and impose a full-on blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and maybe there are others who don't, and maybe who didn't agree with the initial ceasefire. So there are always different levels to this. Now, the way that this happened was, well, rather unfortunate, really, because for one moment there, we thought with the president's announcement and then also the foreign minister's announcement, as you mentioned, pretty much at exactly the same time, that the Strait of Hormuz was entirely open for traffic again. That lasted just a few hours at the end of the day, because what we're hearing now from the parliament speaker, and he's crucial in this, remember, he is the #1 in this negotiating team. He again says, if there is a U.S. blockade, if we can't get through the Strait of Hormuz because the U.S. blockade is of Iranian ports, then no one else is allowed through either.